This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video addresses the question, what is Western civilization? Another term for Western civilization is the Western world, or simply the West. The West is often contrasted with civilizations that are considered non-Western, including India, the Islamic world, sub-Saharan African nations, as well as East Asian nations such as China, Japan, Vietnam, and Korea. An answer that is often given to the question of what is Western civilization is that it is Europe, or even simply Western Europe. Geographically speaking, Europe is a small continent projecting out from Asia. Europe stretches from the Ural Mountains in Russia to Portugal on the Atlantic coast in the west. Yet in many ways, Europe is not geographically coherent or united, far from it. Indeed, Europe contains countries as diverse as Russia, the Ukraine in the east, Italy and Spain in the south, England and France in the west, and all of these countries have little in common with each other in terms of geography and climate, not to mention culture. Now, in the 19th century, European nations such as Great Britain and France increasingly became global powers and dominated much of the world, including large parts of Africa and Asia. And as they did so, Europeans increasingly defined themselves as culturally and even racially superior to others in Asia and in Africa particularly. Europeans used advances in science at the time, including Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution, to rationalize notions of race and racial hierarchies that put Europeans at the top. As scholar Edward Said has argued in his famous 1978 book Orientalism, Europeans in the 19th century also increasingly defined themselves as superior Westerners over and against peoples living to the east of Europe and Asia, as well as in the Middle East and Africa. For Said, Europeans viewed those living in the east as exotic, inferior, and as others. This both distorted their understanding of those living in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, as well as Europeans' understanding of themselves. While Europeans in the 19th century increasingly divided the world into the superior West and the inferior East, Russian thinkers, known as Slavophiles, argued that Russia was not even part of Russian civilization. Rather, in the 19th century, Slavophiles contended that Russia and other Slavic peoples, such as Poles, Czechs, and Serbs, had their own distinct civilization apart from the West. A civilization defined by Slavic languages and culture, peasant values, and more traditional churches such as the Roman Catholic Church in Poland and the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. The Slavophile movement was an important cultural movement during the 19th century, holding Pan-Slavic conferences, beginning with the first Pan-Slavic conference in Prague in 1848. The Pan-Slavic movement only added to the idea that Western Europe was somehow different from the rest of the world. The idea that Western Europe and Eastern Europe were very different was given further credence during the 20th century, beginning with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which resulted in a communist government in Russia, with the old Russian Empire renamed as the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, from 1945 to 1989, the nations of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were all communist. They were labeled as part of the Eastern Bloc, while the democratic and capitalist nations of Western Europe were referred to as the West. Now, the first history classes that were labeled History of Western Civilization were actually taught during the Cold War, particularly in the United States, and they naturally made this East-West distinction. Now, while the concept of Western civilization has had a long and checkered history, if this concept has any coherence today, the concept of Western civilization is one of a cultural concept. Thus, a more meaningful way to address the question of what is Western civilization is not to simply focus on questions of Europe, but to deal with questions of different civilizations on a cultural basis. If one approaches the issue of Western civilization from the perspective of culture, one can get a more coherent definition of Western civilization, including the historical roots of the West culture today. A shorthand cultural answer to the question of what is Western civilization is that Western civilization is a civilization whose cultural roots primarily derive from the nations of Western Europe. This would obviously include Western European nations such as Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. However, it would also include nations far away from Western Europe that were settled by Europeans and today have strong European cultural influences, including language, government, religion, and so forth. This means that nations such as the United States, Canada, the nations of Latin America, Australia, and New Zealand are all Western nations. And again, many of these are very far away from Western Europe. Now, some might include Russia as a Western nation, although as I've already mentioned with the discussion of the Slavophile movement, many Russians strongly object to be labeled as Westerners. Also, some non-Western nations have become heavily Westernized. A good example of this is Japan. The Japanese have adopted everything from Western industry to business to dress to even sports such as baseball. Likewise, many people today in India speak English and are fans of the English sport of cricket. Moreover, soccer, or football as it's known worldwide, began in Europe and is wildly popular across the globe today. Western science and medicine, as well as Western concepts such as democracy, also have spread across the world and have influenced many non-Western nations. And these are just a few examples of Westernization across the world. Yet Westernization does not mean that non-Western nations such as Japan and India have completely abandoned their own cultures and have become Western nations. So if the idea of Western civilization is fundamentally cultural, what are the historical cultural roots of the West? And what are some basic cultural characteristics of the West? Well, the West culture can be broken into three main sources. The first is the civilization of ancient Rome and Greece. And these indeed were the first Western civilizations. Western civilization is widely to have considered to have begun with the ancient Greeks. Ancient Greece was the cradle of Western civilization. Democracy, or the rule of the people, which the modern West takes for granted, was an invention of ancient Athens. The ancient Greek city-states created the first literature of the West, for instance, with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The Greeks invented the first Western theater, with playwrights such as Sophocles and Euripides. Sports in the Western world began with the Greeks, especially the Olympic Games. The Greeks were also noted for their architecture. The symmetrical columns found in structures such as the Parthenon, which was a temple to Athena in Athens, has served as a model for buildings in the West ever since. The ancient Greeks also created philosophy with key figures such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They were also instrumental in the beginning of Western art. And finally, Western mathematics and science, as well as medicine, all had their beginning with the Greeks. While the germ theory has become the dominant theory in medicine since the 1890s, the Hippocratic Oath, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, is a product of Greek medicine. Now, as they moved from a republic to an empire, the Romans conquered the Greeks. In fact, by the 1st century CE, the Romans had built up a huge empire that included today large parts of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Levant. The Romans greatly admired the Greeks, and as such, they adopted much of Greek culture themselves. Now, one popular statement that contrasts the Greeks and Romans is that the Greeks were thinkers and the Romans were doers. Now, while this is a little simplistic, there's also a lot of truth to it. The Romans were known for their feats of engineering, for instance, their roads and their aqueducts. The Romans were also excellent soldiers and government administrators. They produced a very coherent code of law. Roman law today still influences many Western nations. The Roman Empire in the West, however, collapsed around 476 CE. The culture of the ancient world, namely of ancient Rome and Greece, though, has still influenced the West to this day. In terms of languages, modern Western languages such as English, French, Spanish, Italian, and German have heavily borrowed many words from Greek and Latin. Latin, of course, is the language the Romans spoke. Many Romance languages, such as French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, are heavily derived from Latin. Now, the second major cultural source of Western civilization is Christianity. Christianity is a monotheistic religion that came out of Judaism. As a religion, Christianity is centered on Jesus, a Jewish rabbi who lived in the 1st century in Palestine. Christians believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. They believe that He was God incarnate, who rose from the dead after being killed and paid the price for sin for those who believe in Him. Christianity began in the Levant, today what's the Middle East, not Rome or Greece. Many Christians in the ancient and medieval period were not Westerners, or they lived in places that are today no longer considered part of the Western world. For example, St. Augustine, who was a bishop and writer in the 4th century CE, is widely considered today one of the most important, if not the most important, theologians in the history of the Western Church, including both Roman Catholic and Protestant churches. Yet Augustine wrote in Latin, and he was from North Africa, an area today that is predominantly Muslim and Arab and is considered outside the Western world. In addition, most Christians today are not Westerners. China and Sub-Saharan Africa have large and growing Christian populations today. Christianity is thus and has never been exclusively Western or even predominantly Western, nor is it today. But Christianity has had a huge influence on the development of Western civilization. Christianity first began and spread within the confines of the Roman Empire. Moreover, a key portion of Christian scripture, the books of the New Testament, were largely written in Greek, as it was a widely spoken language of the day. The Romans persecuted Christianity sporadically for the first 200 to 300 years of its existence, until the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized it in 313 CE. And it later became the official religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Theodosius. So Christianity has been the dominant religion in the Western world since the 4th century. It spread throughout much of Western Europe during the Middle Ages and beyond to the Americas, Australia, and other places colonized by European powers. Certainly not all Westerners have been Christians in the past, nor are all Westerners Christians today. Still, since the 4th century, Christianity has influenced many aspects of Western culture, including holidays, moral assumptions, literature, art, music, economics, and marriage. To give a few examples, polygamy has been largely taboo in Western nations because of the influence of Christianity. Likewise in terms of holiday, Easter and Christmas are important holidays in the West. Much of Western art and classical music by composers such as J.S. Bach, Handel, and many others is devoted to Christian themes. Many highly prestigious universities in the Western world today, such as the Sorbonne in Paris, Oxford and Cambridge in Great Britain, and Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in the United States, were originally founded by churches to provide an education for the clergy. All of these things came about because of the influence of Christianity. The notion of linear time, that time moves on a track with a beginning, and end, a middle, and end, also comes from Christianity and has influenced secular ideologies such as Marxism. Likewise, the concept of equality, that's very, very prominent in politics today, has Christian origins. Now, the third and final source of Western civilization is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution, which began in the 17th century in astronomy, gave birth to modern science, and by extension, modern technology. Modern science is based on observation and empirically verifiable evidence. This includes scientific institutions that conduct research to advance knowledge of the natural world. The Enlightenment was greatly influenced by the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment was a 17th and 18th century intellectual movement that emphasized science, reason, toleration, and the notion that humans have natural rights. Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke was prominent in advancing the notion of natural rights. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu in France criticized absolute monarchy and advocated for more tolerance and democratic governments. Adam Smith, a Scottish economist during the Enlightenment, is likewise considered the theoretical founder of modern capitalism, with his arguments for freer trade and less government control of markets. Some of the first advocates of women's equality, such as Olympe de Gouges in France, also came out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment also heavily influenced the American Revolution, and the U.S. Constitution itself is a product of the Enlightenment, including the Bill of Rights. So modern politics in the West is heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. So if the main roots of Western civilization are the culture of ancient Rome and Greece, Christianity, and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, what are some of the main characteristics of the West today? A few can be mentioned here. Democracy, individualism, individual rights, freedom of expression, including freedom of speech and artistic freedom, freedom of inquiry, modern industry, agriculture, science, and medicine. All of these things have come in large part from the modern West. However, and in conclusion, it is worth cautioning against praising the West too much or becoming Eurocentric in our focus, or even saying that the West is necessarily superior to other civilizations. It's worth noting the West has also borrowed very heavily from other civilizations. Moreover, Western nations, especially as they became powerful in the modern era, have also dominated and exploited non-Western nations on many occasions. In the 20th century, the West played a key role in the outbreak of several very destructive wars, such as the First World War and the Second World War. Modern totalitarian governments, such as communism, Nazism, and fascism, also all came out of the West. Finally, while modern capitalism and industry have greatly benefited people, it has also come at a terrible cost, including poor treatment of workers and environmental pollution. The world we live in today is a heavily westernized world, and this is both for good and for ill. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your time.